Hey everybody, welcome to the shop. Come hang out with me today as I build a walnut end table inspired by two of my favorite things, Japanese furniture and Star Wars. So I found this little walnut slab online and I couldn't really tell why at the time, but I really just liked the shape of it, so I decided to pick it up. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it reminded me of something from my childhood. And obviously, the proportions aren't perfect, but to me, this slab looks like the Millennium Falcon. So, with that in mind, I decided to draw up a little sketch of what I wanted to build. And the goal here was to make a base that looked kind of like a stand holding up a model of the Millennium Falcon. The first step was to remove the bark from the slab. This was incredibly easy for this slab. It's often really difficult, but most of it just peeled off with my fingers, which was really nice. After the bark was removed, I wanted to address some of the smaller cracks. So for this, I just used some black CA glue. I chose black because it goes best with walnut. And just let it soak into the cracks and sprayed it with accelerator. And in about 10 seconds, it was totally dry. This is a great alternative to epoxy. Epoxy dries a lot harder, but takes much longer to dry, even the fast drying stuff. After the little cracks were all filled, I decided to address this big knot hole in the middle. I am going to use epoxy for this because it's much too deep to try to do anything with CA glue. And rather than building a whole form out of melamine, like a lot of people do for epoxy, I just needed to fill this little center part. So I'm just using some tuck tape to cover the bottom. This is a watertight tape that's usually meant for wrapping houses. But in this application, it just provides a perfect seal to prevent the epoxy from leaking out. And after everything was sealed, I filled all the voids with a deep resin epoxy and some black pigment. I probably could have gotten away without using a deep pour since this is only like a 2-inch knot, but I really didn't want it to crack and overheat, and it is pretty hot outside, so I decided to go with the deep pour. And after filling all the voids with epoxy, I came back with a torch and popped all the air bubbles that came to the surface. With the epoxy drying, it was time to work on the base. The base is also black walnut, and I started just by cutting everything to size. The main pieces of the base are a sort of center structural main beam, as well as two stretchers that go along the top and the bottom, the length of the piece, and then 4 little stabilizing cross pieces. After everything was cut to length, I ripped everything through the table saw to get it to the right width. Next, I needed to cut an angle into the kind of middle main support piece, beam, whatever you want to call it. So I honestly here just picked a random angle that I thought would look good. I think I did 75 degrees, but honestly don't totally remember. But just lined it up on my miter saw and cut the edges off. To attach the cross pieces to the bottom and top stretchers, I decided to use lap joints. In order to do this, you have to hog out half the material from each piece and then sort of cross them over so the slots fit together. There are a few methods to do this. The easiest way for me is to use a table saw. So what I'm doing here is making sure my table saw height blade is exactly half of the thickness of my pieces. Then I grab my miter gauge for my table saw and make sure that everything is lined up, and just one blade width at a time start removing the material. There are definitely faster ways to do this, but in my experience, it's much easier to be exact using the table saw. Some people have miter saws that have trenching features. Some people try to hand cut this, but I've always had the best luck using this method. And after I had cut all the laps in my cross pieces, I did the same in my stretcher pieces. After I finished cutting all my lap joints, I took all the pieces to the workbench and decided to do a dry test fit. These all fit pretty well. A couple of them were a little tight and one was just a little bit loose, but nothing a little glue couldn't fix. I wanted to keep the base as simple as possible, so the focal point of the piece was the slab, but I didn't want it to just be blocky and incredibly basic. So at this point I decided to add a little design feature where I cut basically a big 45-degree chamfer into each of the stretchers and the cross pieces. To do this, I just set my miter saw to 45 degrees and brought each of my pieces over and cut about an inch in off of each of the corners. After I cut the chamfers into the cross pieces, I did the same to the stretcher pieces. Next, it was time to decide how to join the kind of main beam in the middle to the stretcher at the top and the bottom. I have a domino joiner, so I decided to use that. It's quick, easy, and effective. But alternatively, I could have used dowels here, or even cut a mortise and tenon into the top and the bottom of the center beam. After the dominoes were cut, everything was ready for assembly. But first I wanted to give everything a quick sanding. It was just going to be much easier this way. After everything was glued, there was going to be a lot of nooks and crannies to get into. After sanding, it was finally time to glue up. This is a bit of a weird one because of the angles and the multiple pieces going in different directions, but we made it work. After the glue was dry for the main beam, I decided to add a couple of screws just for good measure. The entire weight of the slab is going to be resting on this one joint, so I wanted to make sure it was strong. Then I quickly added some rubber feet to the bottom just to make sure it would sit flat on the floor. Then I had to think about how to attach the slab to the base, and for this I went with figure 8 fasteners. These are really simple to install and allow for seasonal wood movement. Okay, so I'm back in the shop. I have not been able to work on this for nearly a month. I went on my honeymoon for 2 weeks, and then we've had a massive heat wave here, and I don't have air conditioning in my shop. So yeah, nearly a month since I've worked on this, but needless to say, the epoxy is really cured. So now it's time to flatten it all, apply finish, and assemble, and we should be good. As I was getting the piece flat, I decided I wanted to add one more feature to go with the Star Wars theme. And when I think the Millennium Falcon, I think of Han, Chewie, and Luke sitting in the cockpit. So I decided to add a brass detail here. So right where they would be sitting, I drilled a little bit into the slab and then epoxied in some brass dowels. After the dowels were epoxied and hammered in, I cut them as close as I could to the surface of the slab and then filed and sanded them perfectly flush. And there you have it, Han, Chewie, and Luke. And the final little detail is to laser engrave my logo and signature into the bottom of the piece. Then it was finally time for finish. I decided to use Rubio Monocoat for this one. I, like many woodworkers, have a love-hate relationship with finishing. You get the look at what the wood's going to look like, and that's really exciting, but it also is time-consuming and pretty messy. And just like that, this piece was finally done. I was really looking forward to building this piece. I sat on the slab for over a year before I finally had time to build it. I know it's kind of a little quirky and different, but I'm hoping a Star Wars fan out there will be able to enjoy it. All right, that is it for this one, everybody. Thank you for hanging out. If you like this piece and enjoyed watching me build it, it is available on my website, ironsidebuildswoodcraft.com. Go check it out.